Let's talk about the science reasoning test on the ACT. This is a presentation that I made a year or so ago for my students, so we'll just use it as a base to talk about the ACT test in general, specifically the science reasoning test and the changes that I'm seeing on this test. Now, if you want to buy a practice book, if you want an ACT prep book that has all the math you're supposed to know and information about each parts of the test, this is a good one. You can go to Hastings. If they don't have it on the shelf, they'll order it for you. This may be an older version. What you need to look for is you need to look for one that is released by the ACT. There are several ACT prep books out there, and many of them are no good whatsoever. So see where it says official ACT prep, that's what you're looking for. Again, it may be a different color, it may be a newer version, but you're looking for something that says official ACT prep on it. And look at who published it and make sure that it is published by the ACT, meaning that the tests that will be in there were released ACT tests. And so the questions are going to be much more accurate and much more helpful for you to study from. All right, online, there are several things online that you can do. SparkNotes is great. SparkNotes is something you might be familiar with for your literature classes, but they also have a great ACT prep for all four parts of the test, the science reasoning test as well. I will say that the practice questions that are on this site are probably not as accurate as the test prep book that we just talked about, but it's good practice, and the information that they give you, especially like on the math test and the science test, things that you need to know, concepts that you need to know. They give you some great just general basic practice on that. So Google SparkNotes, go to ACT Prep. The ACT Science Reasoning Test is the most feared test, but I believe it's feared for the wrong reasons. By the time you get to the science test, you're tired, you've taken 3 long tests, your brain is mush, you're just sick of testing. So this test gets thrown under the bus a lot. One of the biggest secrets to success on the science test is to stay focused, to treat it not as the end, but to be as fresh on it and as committed to it as you were when you started the English test. Another big secret to being successful on the science reasoning part of the ACT exam is time management. Time is huge on this test. You're given 35 minutes, you have 7 different types of passages, you have to answer 40 questions, so the time crunch is on, students are nervous and tired by the time they get to this test. So this test has a lot not going for it. The content of the science reasoning test, which is, does give some students pause, is really not a big problem because the science content that's on here is really basic science content. If you've had a biology class, a chemistry class, a physical science class, you ought to be able to answer questions of, osmosis and planets and things like that, just your basic science questions. This is a reasoning test. And this is much more, to me, it has much more of a math feel on many of the passages than it does a science feel. Now you have science context, but there's a lot of mathematics going on in this test. You have to be really good at reading tables, really good at reading graphs. So find some practice in that way where you can look at graphs and make connections, big picture connections. So the term science reasoning may sound impressive and may sound difficult, but a lot of it is just the big words and the sciencey words. And for someone like me that, science is my kryptonite, when they start throwing those big sciencey words at me, my eyes cross and my brain just shuts off. But we'll talk about how to work your way through all that. Now, I paid $70 for a book called ACT Secrets. You can pay the money for it if you want to, but fundamentally, I'll have to say I didn't learn a whole lot from that book. They say things in there like the science reasoning test will scare you. For the most accomplished student, most of the terms will be unfamiliar. But the one thing that I did get for the science reasoning test out of there is that once you get past the jargon, you'll find that the test is pretty much kind of like the reading test. Managing your time, again, is one of the most important factors. But if you'll read each passage, especially for a student like me, and you'll treat all the scientific terms as you would if you were reading characters in a novel and you didn't know how to say their name, if you would just accept their names as they are and follow the story, you'll find yourself able to answer the questions on that particular passage much easier. If you get, if you stumble because there's a sciencey word there that you don't understand or you think you might understand, but the rest of the passage really doesn't make sense according to what you understand with the sciencey terms, if you'll just let go of that and understand that you're trying to make connections on the specific information that's given in that passage, really very little science prior knowledge is required to be successful on this test. I will talk about some of the changes again that I'm seeing in the test, but it's not a whole lot of science content that you have to know. All right, so here's a guy that travels around locally, and you may have even gone to some of his seminars. His opinion is the most difficult part of the test is staying focused, and I would agree with that. The content's not difficult. Again, it's the last test. You're exhausted before you even get started. His hints for this test are to take short 5 to 10 second breaks, stretch, refocus. On the test, look for trends in the data. That's what I call big picture stuff. Answer the questions, look for what's changing or what's causing the change to answer the data. Work fast, but not so fast that you make mistakes. But then again, don't obsess over a question. It really is about time management, and I'm going to give you some great hints on time management, so don't worry about that. Okay, so let's go over the instructions for the science reasoning test so that on test day you don't even have to look at them. They're really straightforward. Don't even give them a glance on the test day because you need all of that time to dive right into the science reasoning test. The instructions say this test contains 7 passages, each accompanied by several questions. You should select the answer choice that best answers each question. Within the total allotted time for the subject test, you may spend as much time as you wish on each individual passage. Calculator use is not permitted. Now, this is where timing is an issue, and it says that you may spend as much time as you wish on each individual passage, but understand you have right around a minute or less on average to answer these questions. So if you're spending an inordinate amount of time, 2, 3, 5 minutes trying to answer one question, your best bet there is to guess and move on. All right, so here's the format of the science reasoning test, and this is where we're going to start to talk about how we're going to manage your time. So the science reasoning test has 7 different passages, but there are 3 distinct types of passages. There's data, there's research, and there's conflicting viewpoints. We call that dueling scientists. All right, so 38% of the test are data representation passages. Of the 7 passages, 3 of them are data. 45% of the test are these research summary passages, and there are 3 out of the 7 passages that are research, and only 1 is, which is 17% of the test, is that dueling scientist or conflicting viewpoints. The passages, they appear in no particular order. They don't start at data, then go to research, then go to conflicting viewpoints. They're all mixed up together. All the passages will contain data presented either in paragraphs, conflicting viewpoints, or dueling scientist is usually just a lot of language, not a whole lot of math or graphs or tables. But data and research are full of tables and graphs. Each passage will be preceded by a written introduction or explanation of the data that's presented. There's no standard appearance for the passages, but they all kind of follow the basic principle of giving you information, either graphic or in a table or written text, and you have to work your way through those relationships in order to answer the questions that are in the passages. So here's how we're going to identify what type of passage you're looking at. On the data representation passages, and there are 3 of them, there will only be 5 questions. 5 questions are all there are. Okay? On the research summaries, each of those passages will have 6 questions. So you can identify them readily by just looking at how many questions are attached to the passage. If the passage has 5 questions, you're looking at a data representation passage. And it's important that we can discern the difference between these 3 types of passages. For the one conflicting viewpoints or dueling scientists, there are 7 questions attached to that passage, and there'll only be one of those. That's where the 40 questions come from. And again, we have 35 minutes to answer all those questions, so time management is huge. All right, so you won't need to remember the names. You won't need to remember data, research, or conflicting viewpoints when it comes to the actual test, but you will need to remember the 5, 6, 7 rule. All right? And the science reasoning data passages that have 5 questions attached to them, they usually contain 1 chart, 1 table, 1 graph, 1 illustration, and the questions test your understanding of and ability to use the information presented in the charts. These are the easiest questions, the easiest passages. Usually they just say, what's happening here? What's happening there? Very little comparison is asked of you in the data representation passages. So these are the ones that you're going to do first. You, out of the 7, you're going to identify and circle or write data or put a check mark by all 3 passages that only have 5 questions, and you're going to do those first. That's going to buy you time to get to the research summaries. Those are the ones that have 6 questions. These usually ask you to do 2 things. And those 2 things could be compare to graphs, compare to tables, compare to experiments, compare what went on in experiment 1 and table 1 with an experiment 2 and table 2. And so these are not quite as easy or as straightforward as the data, so you want to do those second. This is the biggest part of the exam. There are 3 of those passages with 6 questions. That's 18 questions, where this is 15 questions, so they're close, but this is going to be a bigger, this is going to contribute more to your science reasoning score than the data passages will. But the data passages, again, are the easiest ones to get correct. So we want to count on all 15 of those being correct, or mostly correct, and then most of these 18 being correct. Now, the conflicting viewpoints, there's only one of those. You want to save it for last. You want this to be the 3rd type of passage that you come to. So identify it. If you have a passage that has 7 questions, there's your dueling scientist or conflicting viewpoints passage, and it's going to ask you to compare 2 thoughts, 2 viewpoints, 2 different scientists, or different, even it could be different entities, 2 different companies or whatever, they're going to have 2 different viewpoints. Now their viewpoints will be close. For the most part, they'll kind of sort of think the same thing is going on, but the difference will be the why they think it's going on, or the result of what's going on, and they'll have differences. And here's one thing I want to make sure that you understand about conflicting viewpoints. Don't bring any of your prior knowledge to this passage, because lots of the information that's in here is incorrect. And this is something that's usually really contemporary, really close to something that's been in the news lately, or science breakthroughs or something like that. So most people are knowledgeable about the content, and if you bring that content knowledge with you and you don't answer based on what's given to you in the passage, then you're going to get the wrong choice here. So answer based on what's given to you in the passage. I'm going to stop here, look for another video, but this at least gets us started. So look for that second video.